Welcome to Pastor's Podcast. Great to have you with us. This is actually part of the Jesus Culture Podcast. Our heart for you, whether you're a pastor, a church leader, if you're in the trenches of building church, that we'd be able to come alongside you, encourage you, hopefully challenge you, get you connected to a larger group of people that are going after revival in our day, which I believe deeply in. And I believe that the church is the vehicle through which revival flows. So great to have you with us. Season 5, Conversations. If you haven't listened to the other 4 seasons, go make sure you listen to them. And before I introduce our co-host today, somebody you would know, I do want to mention that we put a podcast on, but Jesus Culture also has a few other resources for pastors, church leaders, their teams, to really kind of come alongside you. And like I said, hopefully encourage and equip you. But one is this: we have a School of Leadership. It's actually fully online, 2 days a week in the morning. And we have pastors, leaders from different spheres and realms from all over the world that join us. We actually say we want to raise up spiritually mature, relationally healthy, effective leaders. And so I just believe that if you're going to be an effective leader, it means you have to invest in your growth. Check it out. I'd really encourage you to check it out. JesusCultureSchool.com will give you all the information if you're interested in that. We have many, many pastors that jump on with us for the 8 months and just take time to invest in themselves and grow. It's been really, really beneficial. The other thing is we have a conference every January, our pastors conference, that is one of the highlights of my year. What God's doing at that pastors conference is phenomenal. And same thing, we want people to leave more encouraged, more equipped, and more connected when they come. So, and so many people that have a like mind, like heart for revival in our day are showing up to it. So you can check all that information out. Becky Johnson, co-host today, first time ever on the Pastors Podcast as a host.
It's true. This season,
yes. Mm-hmm. And here's what's good about this is you have been kind of upset with me because Becky and I were the hosts for the Jesus Culture Podcast.
Yes, we were.
Which we somehow put on hiatus in COVID and have never brought it back yet.
How many things have died in COVID and have just never...
Oh, it's coming back. It's coming back. That is one that's coming back.
I don't believe you.
We're making it happen.
Do you know why I don't believe you?
Why?
Because we're sitting right here.
I know. So here's Becky was upset because you're like, you have a new favorite. It's the Pastors Podcast.
100%. So we had a great thing at the Jesus Culture Podcast. Encouraged a lot of people. I meet people every time I travel.
It is amazing. People still coming up to me.
The Jesus Culture Podcast, felt pastored by us, discipled by us.
We abandoned him.
And then Banning abandoned you.
Oh, it's COVID.
He had a new vision. He had a new favorite. The Pastors Podcast was the cool friend that showed up that had better clothes.
Listen, I like pastors. I like pastors. I like church leaders. I will say this. I've been so encouraged by this podcast, the amount of people that come and say, hey, I'm so grateful for the conversations. I feel so encouraged because here's the deal. This is way more of a niche. Mm-hmm. This is a niche podcast a little bit.
I was at the Oaks Church in Texas. One of the many, what I found out about Texas is there's a mega church on every corner. I have
said a lot. If I ever want to plant a mega church, I'm going to Dallas to do it.
If you want a mega church, go to Texas.
I'm saying I have a vision to plant a mega church. I'm doing it in Dallas. That's just just reality.
And so I'm at. It was just so funny. I'm like, oh, is that church a little bit smaller than this one? They're like, oh, no, this one's only 3,000. That church down 30 minutes down, that one's 4,000. And I had no words. I was like, oh, okay. They're just all huge. So I was talking to a pastor at the Oaks Church in Texas. We did an event there. Young man, young adults pastor, 23, young. And I asked him what was encouraging him the most. And this isn't flattery because previously I had not been on this podcast. And he said the Jesus Culture Pastors Podcast was challenging him, and he's sending it to all of his friends who are in ministry school are at CFNI and just spreading the word about Pastors Podcast.
There you go. We're doing an ad for ourselves.
Yeah.
We're literally doing an ad for people that are already listening to it, but it's fantastic. Becky, last time you were on as a host of a podcast, you were just a youth pastor. Just a youth pastor.
Just a wee little youth pastor.
And now you are officially promoted to executive pastor, or really probably technically because a lot of people get thrown off by the executive. You're really the senior associate pastor. But the title senior associate pastor, and forgive me for all the senior associate pastors listening right now, it just sounds older. So
Senior
you went with
associate
a little
pastor.
bit more the youthy, edgy, executive pastor kind of deal.
Yep.
Here's what I want to know: going from youth pastor to executive pastor, like what are the big differences that you've run into?
Well,
And executive pastor, you're just inches away from actually doing everything a lead pastor would do.
yes, people ask, executive pastor, you're running the business? Is
Yes,
it just
totally.
the operations? So it is a little bit more like you said. Well, oftentimes, I didn't expect this, but oftentimes I want to go back to youth pastoring. What a difference. It is, the best analogy is you go from just having to clean your room
Yes.
to having to clean the whole house.
whole house.
And that is a lot more responsibility. It's a lot more work. It's a lot more challenging. And so when I was a youth pastor, I'd go speak at events and I'd tell teenagers, be nice to your youth pastor because we're working hard out here. Now,
Be nice to thee.
I go to youth pastor gatherings. I do a lot of youth pastor trainings, summits, and I say, guys, you need to be kind to whoever is in charge of you. And don't just, the things that I annoyed our executive pastor about, my budget, the room I had access to, just, I'm sorry.
So anybody who is in that senior associate level, that executive pastor level, what's funny as well is when you're kind of at the youth pastor level, you're kind of with all your peers and everybody is together, but then you pop up above all of that, and now you realize, wait, does everybody have a problem with me now?
100%.
Because I was all friends with all you guys.
First thing the staff did was I got uninvited to the staff lunch.
Oof,
They had a
ouch.
staff lunch.
Ouch.
And they took me out of the group text thread. And I was like, guys, that's dysfunctional. That's dysfunctional.
Oh, yes, more
Because they're going to
people.
go complain about all the decisions I'm making.
Well, you're making decisions as a youth pastor that don't affect everybody. When you get higher up, all of a sudden you're making decisions that affect people's world, and they're not always happy about it.
100%.
Tell me the main difference you've experienced, the difference between preaching, because you're preaching on Sundays now to, the large body of Christ, preaching to youth compared to preaching regularly on Sundays.
Oh, it's amazing.
What's the difference?
It's so much easier. Because, adults will pity laugh at a joke.
Yes, they actually have some level
They have
of like
empathy and some
Yes.
social awareness of what we're up there doing. So teenagers, with adults, I'm not vying for their attention. For the most part, they're in church because they want to grow.
a lot of youth are there either social or they're because their parents made them go.
100%.
Yeah.
So, and they're on their phones and they're
Yes.
talking to each other, shorter attention spans. So you're just working hard and they're not laughing at your joke because they weren't paying attention for the punchline. They're not clapping your point because they're getting half of it. They're not listening. So adults, they're laughing, they're clapping. Even on a low Sunday where the energy is a little bit dipped, it is miles better than anything at youth group.
This is not encouraging for youth pastors. Youth pastors, I'm sorry, keep it up.
But
God loves you.
Do you know what? You're right. You told me in the throes of youth pastoring, you said you were becoming a better preacher. If you cut your teeth in youth ministry,
for sure,
preaching to youth, you are. I think you're just.
Yeah, you better get to the point. You
worked
better
those
know what your
muscles.
point is.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's helped me.
Well, welcome to the Pastors Podcast. Welcome to the
big
welcome
leagues.
to the adult table.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks so much.
Great to have you. Well, listen, I'm excited today. Really, we want to have some conversations. Just that really challenge the church and just conversations with people that I have a ton of respect for that have impacted me personally. Today is one of those.
Today is a hidden gem. This person that we're about to interview, whenever he comes to speak on Sundays, all I can think of is how much people need to hear this guy.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm so excited. He is a hidden gem in the world.
And many of the missionaries, they're not getting famous. They're not getting church famous.
No.
But when I'm around, I just am so inspired. These guys are incredible. Well, I really am excited to be able to welcome somebody who we consider to be a real friend. And somebody who, when I get around him, I'm not just saying this, am truly inspired and challenged.
Yeah,
I kind of have a philosophy in life that I want to get around the people that inspire me and challenge me, provoke me. And Micah is one of those guys. Micah, we use his first name and don't say the country he's in the Middle East. He'll kind of share a little bit of why that is. But he's been in the Middle East for years now. He'll share a story. He's been a regular, actually, preaching on Sundays. He's one of the main missionaries that we partner with at Jesus Culture here in Sacramento and San Diego. But we've never had him on a podcast. And I think I can say this. This would probably be true across the board for any pastor, missionary, parachurch leader, is that to be on the pastor's podcast is a top 5 ministry moment. Yes?
Top 3.
Top 3. I mean, it's the ministerial peak is what I believe.
Who knows how many people he's had praying for this?
he's had his whole ministry just seeking the Lord.
21 days of prayer and fasting.
So today, guys, you're going to witness an answer to prayer that Micah finally gets to come on the pastor's podcast. Micah, all joking aside, it's so great to have you with us. Thanks for joining the podcast all the way from the Middle East. If you knew the last hour of us trying to get him recorded, because the Wi-Fi, obviously, in the Middle East isn't quite as good as America. But great to have you on, Micah.
Oh, guys, we're here. Hopefully it's clear and recording, because this is the day I have maybe been born for, frankly. It's hard to say, but I guess only in hindsight will we really know if this was, in fact, the peak.
This day will echo throughout eternity, Micah.
Yes.
We're so happy for you.
So, Micah, great to have you. Listen, before we jump in, I know that we're just you're just going by Micah, similar to Bono, Cher, Madonna.
Micah Missionary.
Micah Missionary. Sounds like a kid's show. Micah Missionary. It's great to have Micah Missionary with us. Bob the Builder's next. What can you just kind of give us a little bit of your mission story? I want to talk church. I want to talk comfort. I want to talk missions. Can you give us a little bit of your story?
Yeah, I can. I am actually just taking notes about this great idea of a kid show for supplementary income, so thank you for that. But I do work in the Middle East. We live in the Middle East. I have to be a bit more cautious security-wise, not use my name, my location, mostly because of the people we work with. We work with teams and with believers in really sensitive locations all across the Middle East, traveling in and out. And it's for them really that I have to be a bit more careful. And so thanks for letting me have this moment of stardom, just like Bono. It's really great. But I work with Youth with a Mission, YWAM, across the Middle East. I've been working here in the region for about 13 years. My wife with me, our young son, and expecting another one in March. And so we have made our lives here. We encountered a great joy.
How did you actually get into missions?
I was just a part of a small youth group. I think there was 10 of us. We're mostly still friends. And I remember I was 14 years old, end of summer. They hand us books to read for that fall in this little youth group discipleship program. And it was first one, Jackie Pullinger, Chasing the Dragon.
That's incredible.
And I read it and it blew my mind. Blew my mind that was what God could do. Of course, we have terms for it now. We call it kingdom transformation, societal transformation, things like that. But in my 14-year-old mind, it was simply God can change the world. Wow. And God can change the world through anyone. It just absolutely stuck with me all of my teenage years. Of course, we read more books about more missionaries, and there was such a belief in our hearts that God wanted to change the world. And so out of that youth group, I think about 8 of us became missionaries, which is just amazing. So I came by it honestly. A visiting missionary came through on a Sunday morning. I was 20 years old. They lived in a Middle Eastern country I'd never heard of, had to go home and Google it, went back for the evening service. And that they had a word in the afternoon and invited me to come and live with them. So I bought a one-way ticket a couple months later and moved and have been here ever since.
You've been there ever since. 20 years old, moves to go be with the missionaries, been there ever since. Let me just stop for a moment, because this is a podcast for pastors, by pastors. We're talking to church leaders, anybody really that's in the trenches of building a local church. But one of the least thanked jobs, I don't know if this would be accurate, is youth ministry. We just have teenagers. You mentioned they have no flattery in them at all.
Oh, or empathy.
Or empathy. They're not really interested in making you feel good about yourself. No. But youth pastors, I just want to encourage you. An unbelievable story, because these guys, I'm assuming too, weren't full-time paid youth pastors.
No, they were working regular jobs, an engineer, working in an office.
I just don't think we can really overemphasize the impact of somebody who would volunteer to pour into teenagers and hand them a book at 14 years old. Just a call to something radical. I mean, think about this. 20 years ago, some engineer who just was pouring into some teenagers hands a book to a kid, and now the Middle East is being impacted because of this.
Youth pastors have to, because it's hard to know, and that's what you don't know.
No,
in the
not even
moment,
close.
when it's difficult and it's unpaid and it's unthanked. This is what they don't see is 20 years
It's
down the road.
small, 10 kids.
10 kids. So if you're a youth pastor listening, be so encouraged at what you're doing.
Yeah, and also know that the fruit, you won't really know the fruit for 20 years. That's not like a bumper sticker. That's the reality. Like, you're like, how were you as a youth pastor? I actually don't know. We'll find out in 20 years.
Absolutely.
Because of that thing. Incredible. Micah, I would love to talk a little church. We obviously, this is a pastor's podcast. It's for pastors, church leaders, really anybody in the trenches of building local church. The majority of us, I mean, we come obviously from American mindset, American perspective. We would have people listening from around the world, but I would assume, I haven't done the stats on this, but the majority of them are in some type of a Western context. And so, in the Western context, so much of what we're dealing with is probably coming from kind of cultural Christianity, but the consumerism mindset, kind of comfort above all else type thing. You've lived outside of the American church for your entire adult life, your entire ministerial life for sure. As you come back in and as you're interacting with the American church, living in that context, this is going to be a very broad question, but I don't know a Western culture pastor that isn't concerned about consumerism coming into the church, that isn't concerned about people that aren't actually engaged, isn't concerned about a Christianity that doesn't actually cost them anything, isn't concerned about that type of stuff.
Absolutely.
And I would say from somebody from the outside, what would your advice be? What would your input be? How would you talk to pastors as we are leading people in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, great and important question. And probably I'm not the right guy to ask. I have a different perspective, but I'm also out of touch. I've been out of America for so long that I don't probably get the nuance, the depth of things. But as I come back and I visit, first of all, I love the American church. So I'm not, you won't find me really heavily critical of things. Of course, there's things we could all criticize about everything. So I just choose not to. But the struggle of church wherever we're building it, whether it's in America and you're fighting consumerism, or whether it's in the Middle East and we're fighting the struggle of being rejected from your family if you come to faith, it's cultural elements that is the fight of Christianity.
Wow.
And we have to identify those things and then live in the opposite spirit. And it's really the simplicity, kind of what I would always go back to would be the simplicity of the messages of Jesus, the simplicity of the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, we've got an issue with materialism. Well, what does radical simplicity look like? How do we teach it? And really, I think the older I've gotten and the more experience working with new believers and trying to build believing communities, is the power that preaching has played throughout the history of the church. I just had to finish reading this book on church history. It was pretty academic, but it was really illuminating that I didn't realize the first centuries, how transformational preaching was. And it sounds so simple and so silly, but I'm like, man, I want to hear more preaching on radical simplicity. How do we do that? How do we fight consumerism that way? And not just in it from a, I don't want to stand on this and just have a critical answer, but I just think it's that radical message of Jesus that's the answer for that.
Micah, you said that phrase you said so casually struck me. Like you said it, in America, you become a Christian, you might get made fun of. In the Middle East, your immediate family might reject you.
Yes.
I mean, this is what we can just not realize living over here apart from that kind of those kind of cultural elements. I thought, oh my gosh. How do we help lead people? How are you helping lead people when what you're doing into that? Because the radical abandonment message is the same no matter what cultural context you're living in, whether it's I'm going to get made fun of or my immediate family might disown me. It requires that radical following Jesus at all costs. How do we help lead people into that? How do we create a culture of costly Christianity and radical obedience to him?
Yeah, I mean, huge and great questions. I'm kind of, as you're saying that, question about how do we lead people into it, the first thing that comes to my mind is that following Jesus for 2,000 years has always been costly for those who choose to do it. And there's something about when we don't feel the cost, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm living this like crazy intense life where there's a mob of people outside, right now. There's not, but there are seasons like that. And it's always in the seasons that aren't like that where you have to remember the cost when it doesn't feel costly. And so let me say it this way. I was with this family this summer, and they had one of their sons, I don't remember how old he is, maybe he's like 10 or 11. He had gone to like a VBS type thing, like a week-long kids thing. And he was sharing with us about it at dinner, kind of what his takeaways were. And he said, I felt, just super casually, just like this, he goes, I felt God call me to move to Saudi Arabia. And I was thinking, what? And so I was really curious about the context for that experience for this kid. And I couldn't find out. This particular family has a tradition where kind of once a week, Sunday nights, family dinner, they read a story, just a short story that'll keep the kids' attention, about a Christian who is presently experiencing persecution.
Wow.
Jeez. And this family doesn't. They live in a modern society with a Christian majority. And yet they have made it a part of their faith to remember that their faith doesn't always look like it does in that moment.
Wow.
It makes me do that. I think it's in Hebrews or in James, I forget right now, but that we would remember those among us who suffer.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think that is like such a foundational key for all of us, that we'd say, okay, I was not saved into simply eternity, but I was saved into God's family. Mm-hmm. And his family is having an experience around the world that maybe I'm not sharing, but I have been invited to share with them. And then that takes me to the second question you asked, Becky, about what do we do? And in simplicity, it's remembering when we're walking with new believers that they have been called into the family of God, and we are that family. Mm-hmm. We can't always bear the brunt of the suffering. And I'll say I've never been to jail, but I have had my friends and people that I'm walking with and people I'm discipling in jail, and I have been there to meet them when they're released. And it's miserable. It's awful. It's such deep pain to walk with them through that. But that's what we're saved into. We're saved into God's family. And even I would say to the wonderful churches in the Western world that maybe don't experience that there's probably something to be gained in actively remembering those who suffer for their faith.
We have to be honest about the fact that our culture doesn't want to face pain. I'm just thinking, gosh, this is, it's so easy to go, oh, it's happening over there, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about the sex trafficking that's happening. Yeah. I don't want to think about the horrific, scenes that are happening in other nations. And gosh, Micah, can you share a little bit about that's some of the real barriers to just putting this in front of people? That family had to specifically say, we're going to read a story about modern day persecution. If we're honest, we don't want to talk about what was hard about our day. We're so, accustomed to numbing pain and not facing it, that there has to be something that looks at that first and says, okay, I avoid pain in just my normal day life. I really have to look at this thing if I'm going to be effective.
Oh yeah, 100%. I am in the avoid club. And it's like not gotten any better the older I've gotten.
That's fascinating.
It is really like it's become clearer the older I've gotten, where an opportunity will arise to serve a group of people that need to serve. A couple of years ago, in COVID, where we were living, there was a problem like there was around the world. The short story is a particular embassy phoned us because there were a number of women from that country that had been trafficked into where we were living as prostitutes, and they had escaped their brothels that had closed down in COVID, and they didn't have anywhere to go. And they were asking if there one girl in particular, she was 19, she was sleeping in a broom closet at the embassy. They asked if we would take her in. We had a little tiny 2-bedroom apartment. And I just thought, no, I don't want to do that, actually. Like, there's nothing in me that feels like a great missionary right now. That feels super uncomfortable in lockdown. And it was so uncomfortable. And she was in such a state. She had all sorts of disease that you could imagine had come through that lifestyle, and it affected our house. We had all sorts of disease in our house. We had to change the sheets. My houseplants died because they got bugs. There was nothing great about it, except for the fact that she, for the first time at the end, when she left our house, she was in tears because my wife had spent so much time with her, just sharing with her about Jesus and then giving her the love of Jesus.
Wow.
And I mean, of course, it sounds great at the end. I thought that was awesome. We were great. In the moment, I was like going on a lot of prayer walks.
I love hearing that it just because you're saturated in it doesn't mean it's any easier. This is what Jesus says. You have to take up suffering consistently.
Tell me about so much of your life it has just been, I know that we tend to romanticize so much stuff, and I love that you don't romanticize it, but just the joy behind radical obedience. So much of what we're talking about for me right now isn't even, Mike, even one of the reasons I have you on here isn't even to talk about missions, but that the world that you're in and the life that you've chosen, the yes that you said to Jesus, I believe that culture we have to begin to get into our churches. That even though maybe not everybody's going to say yes to go on the mission field, there is this radical obedience and this radical yes that I think we can still carry if you're showing up to, the corner office every day type deal. But what have you found in your journey, even the description of taking in that lady, just the radical yes, the radical obedience, and the joy and the fulfillment and the only way to live type lifestyle you've encountered from that?
Oh, man, what a great question. And I mean, that is the dream, that all of our churches would have a culture of radical, sold out hearts for God. And I wish I had a great answer like here's the 1, 2, 3, but it's the daily abiding in Jesus is the simple answer. And for me, I think the joy that's abiding, I can look back at particularly hard times, and it was this one thought that I could see. You know how you like later on as you live more life, you could see certain parts of your heart have increased, and like the joy in Christ has increased, and I could trace it back to these thoughts in hard times where I would think Jesus knows this pain. That Jesus knows this experience, and it was this relating to him in the way that he related to us. The example I could think of right now, my wife and I really struggled to have children, and we couldn't get pregnant, and when we did, we had a number of miscarriages. After the last one, I was really struggling to find hope. And I was just sitting on the couch one day just thinking, Lord, I really want to hear you about this. And I just had this thought where I thought, oh, Jesus knows what it's like not to have children.
Wow.
And I was thinking about it, according to that time, Jesus at 30 years old, all of his friends from school, their kids would have been like 10 and 12 years old. But he knew what it was like to not have kids. And it's those moments, I think, that where we experience the reality that Jesus is so near to us and so and has shared in our experiences that produces, at least in me, it produces this like, I want to live everything for him.
Yes.
because he's in it. I'll be with you always. And we find those moments where he's with us. Usually they're dark moments. And occasionally they're great high moments, but those are harder. I mean, those aren't as hard to find him in. But I think the radical culture comes in radical intimacy.
It's funny how we talk wherever you are in the world, whether it's what we're dealing with in America, whether it's what you're dealing with, it's really the same. It's just radical intimacy. It's just like, are we creating an environment? Are we discipling people into a place of radical intimacy that the result then is just radical obedience?
Yeah.
I live in a context where there's religious fanaticism. They're fanatic for their faith because their faith is something that they have to attain. They have to live to do something for it. But the opposite in our walk with Jesus, we're not fanatics, although we might be labeled that way. but we've experienced the radical love of God in such a true way that it's an organic expression out of our lives. And I mean, that's the story of my youth group, to go back to that, it was just all about being sold out for Jesus because he was sold out for us.
Micah, let me shift a little bit right now. It's really when I encountered Andy Bird for the first time, and I don't know, maybe I'm embarrassed saying this as a full-time pastor for now almost 30 years. When I really sat down with Andy Bird, who's a YWAM, and then you, and I began to actually kind of start talking about these unreached people groups in the earth. It was fascinating to me. It was just not something I'd really dove deep into. I have a real heart for America. I have a real heart for revival in the nations. You know, we are in a lot of Western nations with what we do, and I have a real heart for it. Like I said, I'm not down on the church in America. I am believing God for the greatest harvest America has ever seen. I'm believing God for the greatest harvest the UK and Australia and Brazil and these different places. But as I sat with Andy and he began to speak to me about unreached people groups and even how you define unreached nations, how you define unreached people groups, but then also these places that don't have scripture. They've never heard the name Jesus. The gospel is not. In the midst of we're believing God for America, I am feeling so stirred about the global harvest that would be labeled as unreached.
Yeah. And what's our part in it?
And what's our part in it? Can you
do?
kind of talk about why it's important that we would actually have a focus on these unreached people groups? That may be such a basic question, but I think the Lord's really on some of this stuff right now, and what you guys are doing and different ones that I'm connected with that are actually on the front lines of it. And I know that what YWAM and Lauren Cunningham and that concept of every tribe, every tongue, can you maybe just address that and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I'm glad to hear you. You know, I've taught Andy a lot, and so I'm glad that was had an impact. But I guess the short of it, not to get like too deep in the weeds of statistics, but if you just look at the global population, and I'm saying this, I'm an American. I love America. I'm married to a Texan, which I think is about as American as they get.
Oh, that's another level. Talk about fanatics.
Yeah. Talk about already saved, an already reached people group.
Exactly. Well, you know, America, if you look at the population of the globe, America's like 5%. I remember when I first moved overseas, one of my grandparents said to me, "Why do you have to go out of America? Can't you minister here? Don't people need God here?" And I said, yeah, that's true, but 95% of the world live outside of here. Like, it seems like we also give that a go.
Americans don't think that way. We're like, this is 95% live here. This is 95% of the earth. I mean, really.
Part of me loves that we think that way, and then part of me hates that we think that way.
I know, like 5%.
Part of me loves that we're that confident.
Micah, I knew that, and I forgot that until just now.
Did you see the guy in the track? You don't follow sports.
I love sports.
But he totally was going after the fact that the NBA calls themselves the world champions when they're only playing Americans, or when they're only playing there's more than Americans in the league. But
that's what I'm saying.
That's funny.
You know, and every country is probably like that. I think it's not unique to America. America just has bigger sports teams to make that a problem. But it's around the world. And I think what maybe we don't, at least I'll speak for myself, what I didn't realize until I lived in it was the reality of the lack of access people have to the gospel.
Wow.
We were in Saudi Arabia a couple of months ago. We were driving around, and we stopped at this coffee shop one afternoon, and it was like super trendy. Everyone in there looked like they were just in some coffee shop in LA. Like, everyone was just cool. But we were literally in the middle of the desert, and I was so shocked. And so I go up to the manager, and he's this young guy. He's like 23, 24, young guy from that small town, dressed so cool, and he doesn't speak any English. And I ask him, I say, where did you get your clothes? Because there's clearly like no stores there. And his answer was so shocking. He said, ASOS. That was so awesome. So you have this kid that looks like every other kid in LA that shops at the same stores.
Wow.
And as he and I start talking, I come to find out he'd never even met a Christian. Never met one.
What?
And he was asking me all these questions, and he didn't come out and say that. He didn't say I've never met a Christian, but he's asking me these really basic kind of probing questions. And I said, do you know any Christian? He goes, no, I've never met him. Obviously, this place, there's only Muslims where he lives. And it was so amazing to me to think, gosh, if you picked him in a lineup, he would be the last guy you would choose as being totally unreached, having no access to the gospel.
Yeah.
He had looked like he would have shared my same cultural references, had my same experience. Maybe he had a Bible, someone gave it to him, and never read. No. Never met a Christian, never heard the story of the gospel like we would know it. And the reality is there's, something like 4 billion people like that in the world, which is almost half the world.
It's incredible. My heart's been so stirred around this issue of just the unreached people groups. And those that don't have the scripture in their language as well has been such a massive thing.
Micah, I don't know if you could answer this, but I'm thinking, all right, I'm a pastor, I'm listening to this. I'm now aware of that. What do I do? What's a step I can make in my church, in my leadership context, to move towards that? He has access to fashion.
But not the gospel.
But not the gospel. He has access to the same designers that we're wearing.
Yes.
But not the God that
It's
we
incredible.
serve.
Yeah, a great question. And of course, there's actionable points and mission plans and things like that. And the American church is so incredible with generosity and funding so many things. But I think it probably goes back to that idea of radical intimacy. And there's probably a place where we could teach God's heart for these people in these remote places, where there's this like active participation in prayer. Maybe we have to do like a geography lesson in our Sunday school classes and say, here's a map of the world and point out. But there's, the Joshua Project, all sorts of resources online where we could actually engage with this global idea. And it's really a Christian idea, saying we are one family. Yes. And that we would teach our congregations to pray for the world because we're not different, that we are really in this wonderful, beautiful expression of every culture, that one day what we'll see Revelation 4 standing before the throne, that we're a part of that now. And I think there's probably a place to answer your question, Becky, is really to engage in prayer. It's just simple prayers. It doesn't have to be all night prayers and fasting, but just this month we're going to really pray for this nation that God would break in with the gospel.
I love that. So good. Joshua Project has been really incredible in that. Well, Micah, listen, I know it was quite the journey of just recording this. Not everybody would know listening to this because we edit out all of the times you sounded like a robot and or we got cut off or whatever else, but so appreciate you jumping on. I know that we can't fully direct everybody to you, but if you go to jcsacramento.com or jesusculture.com and go to giving, actually in one of the drop-down menus is Micah. You'll just see Micah, YWAM missionary. And if it's on your heart to support Micah and jump in. I believe this in somewhat, obviously giving, I do think we need to educate people. I do think we need to really begin to give our kids and our people an understanding that we're part of a worldwide family.
Yes.
And much of that family is being persecuted. Much of that family is, and that God's heart for those that have no access to the gospel, that have no access to Scripture. But at some level, practically speaking, I remember Bill, our pastor Johnson, would just say, hey, not all of us can go, all of us can send. And I think that concept of really engaging people, I will challenge, this is maybe a whole nother topic, but let me talk to pastors real quick. The reality is the majority of churches in America, the majority of people that are church-going people don't actually give. The statistics are actually very sobering, a little depressing. And so continually engaging the culture of saying, listen, no, we give.
Challenge them.
We tithe, we give to missions, we partner with people on the front lines, reaching the people that are unreached, that are on God's heart. And so I love that. So although you can't connect right now with Micah, you can go get online and support him. Micah, we sure appreciate you taking some time just to jump in and be with us. It means a lot.
It's been such a joy, and thank you for your love and encouragement to us as a family. But really, thank you for your prayers and concern for believers that maybe others wouldn't know about. It delights my heart, but more than that, it delights the heart of God.
All right, we'll do it again. Well, Becky, well done. Well done. Well done being on the Pastor's Podcast.
You can rate Becky as a host by going to...
Or if you want to listen to more of her, go back a couple years whenever we had a Jesus Culture podcast.
The Forgotten Podcast.
A lot of that stuff going on. But so great to have all of you guys. Listen, I want to remind you again, Jesus Culture School Leadership, JesusCultureSchool.com if you're interested in learning how to jump in and just kind of grow in your leadership. A lot of pastors jumping on that. And then also Pastors Conference happens every January here in Folsom in the Sacramento area.
Yep.
We'd love to have you be a part of that as well.